In the early months of 2014, Summerville, South Carolina, was like any other picturesque American suburban town. Nestled among its tree-lined streets and cozy neighborhoods stood Jennings Family Dental, the well-established practice of Dr. Matthew Jennings, a 41-year-old dentist who had gained a sterling reputation over the years. His practice, located in the heart of Summerville, was widely regarded as one of the best in the area. The clinic was known for its modern equipment, clean, inviting environment, and a personal touch that many found comforting. Patients, particularly young college students from the nearby university, flocked to Jennings Family Dental, attracted not only by the discounted rates, but by Matthew's warm demeanor and professional expertise. Matthew Jennings was more than just a dentist in his community. He was seen as a pillar of integrity, often volunteering at community events, donating to local causes, and supporting youth sports programs. Parents trusted him with their children's dental health, believing that he truly cared about the well-being of his patients. His friendly nature, coupled with his meticulous work, made him the go-to dentist for students needing affordable care and for families who wanted the best. On the surface, Matthew's life seemed perfect. He lived in a beautiful, spacious home on a quiet street with his wife, Hannah, and their 10-year-old daughter, Grace. Hannah, 38, was a beloved elementary school teacher who was known for her patience and kindness. Together, they projected the image of the perfect family, a hard-working professional couple raising their daughter in a loving and stable environment. Their life appeared to be a reflection of the American dream, with weekend barbecues, family outings, and regular church attendance. But underneath the facade of suburban bliss, Matthew harbored a secret that would shatter the illusion of his perfect life. Matthew was struggling with his hidden sexual orientation. For years, he had managed to conceal his true identity from those closest to him, including his wife, Hannah. But Matthew's internal conflict did not end with secrecy. It evolved into something far more dangerous. Over time, he had developed a disturbing compulsion that he kept hidden from everyone. Matthew's clinic was equipped with state-of-the-art sedation technology, which allowed him to perform complicated procedures without causing his patients pain. He had easy access to a variety of anesthetics and sedatives, tools that, in the hands of a trusted dentist, were meant to ease discomfort. But Matthew began to use these tools for sinister purposes. Over time, he devised a disturbing plan that involved sedating young, male patients, often college students who were drawn to the clinic by student discounts, and engaging in inappropriate acts while they were unconscious. What made Matthew's crimes all the more chilling was the methodical nature with which he executed them. He carefully chose his victims, targeting young men who were new to the area, financially strapped, and unlikely to question extra sedation for routine procedures. His practice gave him the perfect cover. No one would suspect that their well-liked dentist was anything but professional. Using hidden cameras installed in the procedure room, Matthew recorded everything that happened while his patients were under sedation. These recordings were not just for his personal viewing. In a further escalation of his deviant behavior, Matthew began selling the footage on dark web forums. This underground network provided him with both anonymity and a way to profit from his crimes. The dark web allowed him to build a double life, one where he could indulge in his darkest compulsions without fear of being caught. At least, that's what he thought. In Summerville, Matthew maintained the appearance of a man in control. At home, he was the attentive husband, the caring father, and the man who was always present for his family. With Grace, his young daughter, he played the role of the doting dad, attending her soccer games and helping her with homework. To the world, the Jennings family was happy, content, and ordinary. But inside Matthew, a storm was brewing. His compulsion was becoming harder to manage, and every recording he sold further pulled him into the depths of his secret life. The pressure of maintaining the perfect facade weighed on him constantly, and though he feared exposure, his addiction to power and control over his victims kept driving him deeper into his crimes. The very success that made him untouchable in the community also allowed him to exploit his position with ease. As 2014 unfolded, Matthew Jennings believed he had everything under control. His family, his patients, and his colleagues had no idea what was happening behind closed doors. It was a seemingly ordinary afternoon in early June when Hannah Jennings stumbled upon a discovery that would shatter her world. She was alone in her quiet home in Summerville, South Carolina, sorting through old family photos on her husband Matthew's laptop. Matthew, a well-respected dentist in town, was still at his clinic, finishing up his day's appointments. Their daughter Grace was at a friend's house, leaving Hannah with a rare moment of solitude. She had intended to use the family photos for a scrapbook project, but what she found instead would change everything. As Hannah sifted through various folders on the laptop, she came across one labeled Records. At first glance, she assumed it was work-related, something related to Matthew's dental practice, perhaps patient files or clinic logs. Out of idle curiosity, she clicked on it. The folder opened, revealing hundreds of video files, each meticulously labeled and dated. For a moment, Hannah didn't register what she was looking at. Then, with a sense of dread creeping over her, she opened the first video. The screen flickered to life, and there it was. Footage from inside Matthew's dental clinic. A young man, clearly unconscious, was lying back in the dental chair, completely limp under sedation. But it wasn't the medical procedure that horrified Hannah. As the video continued, it became clear that Matthew wasn't providing care. He was violating the patient, taking advantage of the young man's defenseless state. Hannah's hand flew to her mouth in shock. She quickly clicked through several more videos, each one revealing the same horrific acts. Young men, most of them appearing to be college-aged, sedated and unaware of what was happening to them, were being exploited by her husband. Some of the faces she even recognized, former patients of Matthew's clinic, men who had once trusted her husband with their care. The realization hit Hannah like a freight train. This wasn't just a dark secret. This was criminal, monstrous behavior, and her husband had documented it all. Hannah's mind swirled with disbelief. Her heart pounded as she felt the full weight of what she had uncovered. The man she had spent 14 years of her life with, the father of her child, was leading a double life more horrifying than she could have imagined. The Matthew she thought she knew, the loving husband, the doting father, the respected dentist, was a facade. Beneath it lurked a predator. Her hands trembled as she shut the laptop, her chest tight with a mix of fear, anger, and disgust. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think straight. This was the man who shared her bed, who kissed their daughter goodnight. How long had this been going on? How had he hidden something so vile for so many years? Her emotions vacillated between fury and devastation as she tried to comprehend the enormity of the situation. Hannah began to pace the room, her thoughts racing. What was she supposed to do now? Should she call the police? Confront Matthew? And what about Grace? How could she explain any of this to their innocent daughter? The enormity of what lay ahead weighed heavily on her. But one thing was certain. She couldn't ignore this. She couldn't allow Matthew to get away with what he had done. He had violated not only the trust of his patients, but also the sanctity of their marriage. Hours passed as Hannah waited for Matthew to return home. Her mind was a whirlwind of anger and disbelief, but her resolve solidified. She needed answers. She needed to confront him. When Matthew finally walked through the door that evening, the house felt different, colder, more ominous. He loosened his tie as he entered the living room, unaware of the storm brewing inside his home. Hannah was sitting on the couch, her posture stiff, her eyes locked on the laptop in front of her. There was no warmth in her expression, no greeting. She didn't look at him like a wife anymore. She looked at him like a stranger, someone she didn't recognize. Matthew hesitated, sensing something was off. "Everything okay?" he asked, his voice casual, but Hannah didn't respond. Instead, she picked up the laptop and opened it to the folder labeled Records, displaying the incriminating videos in full view. She didn't need to say anything. The evidence spoke for itself. Matthew's heart sank as his eyes landed on the screen. He knew instantly what she had found. Panic surged through him. His carefully constructed world was beginning to crumble, and there was no escape. His mind raced for a way out, but it was too late. Hannah knew everything. The silence between them was suffocating. Then, with an icy calmness that barely contained the rage bubbling underneath, Hannah demanded an explanation. She didn't shout, but her words were laced with fury. Matthew tried to stammer out a defense, but there was no justification he could offer that would make this right. He had been caught, and the enormity of his actions was laid bare. As the confrontation escalated, Hannah's anger boiled over. She threatened to go to the police, to expose everything and destroy his life. The accusations flew, each one hitting Matthew like a punch to the gut. But behind his panic was something darker. Fear. Fear of losing everything he had built. Fear of facing the consequences of his actions. The confrontation reached its breaking point as Hannah made it clear that there was no way out for Matthew. The evidence was undeniable, and she wasn't going to stay silent. Matthew's life, the practice, his reputation, his freedom, was slipping through his fingers. He could feel everything unraveling. For Matthew, the weight of her words struck him like a physical blow. Panic surged through his body, overwhelming his thoughts. The walls seemed to close in as he imagined everything collapsing. The respect he had garnered in the community, his thriving dental practice, and the carefully constructed facade of his perfect family. His heart raced, his mind desperately searching for a way out of the corner he had backed himself into. The confrontation spiraled out of control. Matthew's fear and guilt turned into a potent mix of anger and desperation. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much to let everything slip away like this. As Hannah's accusations grew louder and more intense, his ability to think rationally vanished. She was threatening to obliterate his life, and in that moment, Matthew couldn't see beyond the immediate threat. Then it happened. In a fit of rage, Matthew lunged forward. The movement wasn't premeditated, but it carried all the force of his fear and frustration. His hands shoved her back with more power than he realized. Hannah stumbled, her heel catching on the edge of the rug, her arms flailing as she lost balance. Time seemed to slow as she fell, her body twisting awkwardly before she hit the corner of the stone fireplace with a sickening crack. The sharp sound echoed through the room, followed by a haunting silence. Hannah collapsed to the floor, motionless. The blood pooling under her head was the only movement in the room. For a moment, Matthew stood frozen, his breath caught in his chest. The reality of what had just occurred crashed over him in waves. He had killed his wife. His mind raced, a chaotic whirl of fear and disbelief. He hadn't meant to hurt her. He had only wanted to stop her, to make her listen. But now she lay lifeless at his feet, her once angry voice forever silenced. Matthew's panic intensified. He knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he shook her, whispering her name as if he could somehow reverse the damage he had done. But it was too late. The gash on her head was deep, and her pulse was gone. Her body, which had once been so full of life and passion, was now cold and still. Thoughts of self-preservation quickly took over. He had to hide this. He had to make it look like an accident. Something, anything, to avoid the full wrath of the law crashing down on him. His mind raced through possible scenarios, but none seemed plausible enough to shield him from the consequences of his actions. The crime was too raw, too fresh. Every detail of their argument hung in the air, and his fingerprints, literally and figuratively, were all over the scene. Just as Matthew began to consider his next steps, a small, terrified voice pierced the quiet. Grace, their 10-year-old daughter, had been in her bedroom upstairs, but she had heard the shouting. The loud crash that followed had sent chills down her spine, and she had crept halfway down the stairs just in time to see the horrifying sight of her mother lying still on the floor. Wide-eyed and shaking, she didn't fully understand what had happened, but the sight of blood and the look on her father's face told her something was very, very wrong. In her young mind, there was only one thing to do. She turned and ran to the kitchen, where the house phone rested on the counter, her small fingers fumbling to dial 911. As she relayed her sobbing, disjointed account to the operator, Matthew heard her voice from the living room. His blood ran cold. It was over. The sound of Grace's frantic call to the police broke through Matthew's stunned haze. He rushed toward her, trying to calm her down, to take the phone away, but it was too late. The operator had already dispatched the authorities, and there was no undoing what had been set into motion. His once orderly and controlled life had unraveled in the span of a few terrifying minutes, and now he stood on the precipice of ruin. When the police arrived at the Jennings household, the scene immediately raised red flags. Matthew Jennings, pale and visibly shaken, met the officers at the door, his words stumbling as he attempted to explain the tragic situation. He claimed that Hannah had fallen during a heated argument, striking her head on the fireplace. The story seemed plausible at first glance, but something about Matthew's demeanor, his stammering explanation, his overly rehearsed tone, put the officers on edge. As the police entered the living room, their eyes fell on the lifeless body of Hannah Jennings, sprawled awkwardly on the floor, a pool of blood beneath her head. The details of the scene didn't align with Matthew's story of an accidental fall. The blood spatter, the position of the body, and the clear signs of a struggle raised immediate suspicions. In the corner, 10-year-old Grace stood, her face pale, eyes wide with shock. She was visibly shaken, clutching the phone she had used to call 911. When one of the officers knelt beside her, speaking softly, Grace began to recount what she had witnessed. Her words, though fragmented and confused, revealed the truth about what had happened. She told them about the argument, the yelling, and the moment her father had pushed her mother. She didn't understand why, but she knew something terrible had occurred. The officers quickly realized they were dealing with more than a tragic accident. The situation demanded a full investigation. They secured the scene and immediately called for backup, ensuring that the evidence would be carefully documented. As they began to question Matthew, his story faltered. His explanations grew more erratic, and the inconsistencies piled up. Why hadn't he called for help immediately? Why were there signs of a cover-up? Why was he so desperate to leave certain details out? As Matthew was taken in for further questioning, detectives arrived to process the scene. They searched the house, cataloging every piece of evidence. Among the items collected was Matthew's laptop, the same device Hannah had used earlier that day. What the detectives would soon uncover would transform the case from a potential manslaughter charge into something far more sinister. The laptop's contents proved to be a treasure trove of damning evidence. When the detectives first opened the files, they found exactly what Hannah had seen earlier. Disturbing videos of Matthew engaging in illegal and immoral acts with unconscious male patients in his dental chair. These were not isolated incidents. There were hundreds of files, each carefully labeled with dates, patient information, and detailed descriptions of the procedures. As forensic experts began to comb through the digital evidence, the full extent of Matthew's crimes became horrifyingly clear. For years, Matthew had been using his dental practice to exploit vulnerable young men, primarily college students who came in for discounted care. The victims, sedated under the guise of legitimate dental procedures, were filmed without their knowledge. The recordings were carefully edited, and the raw footage was not only saved, but distributed on the dark web. Matthew had built an entire hidden online operation, selling the videos to a network of buyers on illicit websites. Digital forensics revealed financial records linking him to numerous transactions, with payments funneled through cryptocurrency to avoid detection. What had started as a domestic tragedy now spiraled into a high-profile case involving predatory exploitation, cybercrime, and deep-rooted betrayal. As news of the investigation spread, former patients began to come forward. Some were horrified to learn that they had been among Matthew's victims. Their private visits to the dentist turned into traumatic violations. The scope of the investigation widened as detectives began contacting other dental patients, many of whom had no idea what had occurred while they were under sedation. Somerville, a typically quiet and suburban town, became the epicenter of a national scandal. News outlets quickly picked up the story, and the media frenzy that followed transformed Matthew's case into front-page headlines. Reports highlighted not only the personal betrayal within the Jennings family, but also the shocking abuse of trust in a medical setting. This was no longer just about the death of a wife. It was a story of exploitation, betrayal, and the dark underworld of the internet. Matthew's once pristine reputation was shattered overnight. The dental practice, once bustling with loyal patients, shut down as authorities began to raid the office, searching for any additional evidence of his crimes. The community was rocked, and those who had once trusted Matthew as their dentist now felt betrayed, violated, and outraged. As the pieces of the puzzle came together, it became clear that this was far more than an isolated case of violence. It was the uncovering of a long-running operation that exploited trust, manipulated power, and preyed on the vulnerable. The full scope of Matthew's crimes, both in the physical and digital realms, had been exposed. The stage was set for what would become one of the most significant criminal cases Somerville had ever seen. The investigation had just begun, but it was clear that Matthew Jennings' carefully constructed world had come crashing down. The trial of Dr. Matthew Jennings began in late 2014 and quickly became a media spectacle. The case, which initially shocked the quiet town of Somerville, South Carolina, had garnered national attention due to its deeply unsettling nature. The courtroom was packed every day with reporters, former patients, and curious onlookers, all eager to see how the justice system would handle a man who had been a trusted member of the community, now revealed to be a serial predator. Matthew, dressed in a dark suit that appeared ill-fitting in his current state of stress and despair, sat at the defense table, flanked by his attorneys. He looked gaunt, his face marked with sleepless nights and the burden of impending judgment. Across from him, the prosecution prepared their case, led by an experienced district attorney who was determined to secure a conviction that would send shockwaves through the town and beyond. The prosecution wasted no time in painting a damning portrait of Matthew Jennings. From the very start, they outlined the calculated nature of his crimes. He had not only violated the trust of his patients, many of them vulnerable young men, but had done so systematically and without remorse. They detailed how Matthew used his position as a dentist to drug his patients under the guise of legitimate procedures, then proceeded to record their unconscious bodies, exploiting them for his own gain. This alone was horrifying, but the case reached a new level of depravity when the prosecution introduced evidence of his involvement in the dark web. Forensic specialists took the stand to explain how they had recovered files from Matthew's encrypted laptop, revealing hundreds of videos meticulously organized by date and victim. The files also contained records of transactions on dark web forums where Matthew had sold these videos to anonymous buyers. They presented evidence of cryptocurrency payments Matthew had received, showing the calculated nature of his operation. The prosecution highlighted how Matthew had gone to great lengths to conceal his activities, employing sophisticated encryption and evading detection for years. The testimony of the victims was one of the most emotional and impactful aspects of the trial. Several young men who had been patients of Matthew took the stand, their voices trembling as they recounted their experiences. They described how they had trusted Matthew, some even recalling how they had seen him as a father figure in their lives. These men, now knowing what had happened to them while they were sedated, struggled to contain their emotions as they described the violation of trust. The courtroom fell silent as each victim spoke, the gravity of Matthew's actions weighing heavily on everyone present. The most heartbreaking moments came when the families of the victims spoke. Parents who had trusted Matthew with the care of their sons expressed their outrage and devastation. One father, voice-breaking, recounted how his son had been sent to Matthew's clinic for a simple dental procedure, only to unknowingly become a victim of a heinous crime. The emotional toll of these testimonies visibly impacted the jury, many of whom were seen wiping away tears. In response, the defense tried to shift the narrative, portraying Matthew as a man who had been driven to the edge by years of inner turmoil. They argued that his hidden sexuality had led to a psychological breakdown, and that Matthew's actions, while inexcusable, were the result of mental illness. They introduced testimony from a psychologist who claimed that Matthew's repressed identity had created a dangerous internal conflict, driving him to commit these acts out of desperation rather than premeditated malice. However, the prosecution was quick to dismantle this argument. They pointed to the sophistication of Matthew's operation, how he had methodically encrypted his files, sold the videos, and even established a network of buyers. This was not the behavior of a man spiraling out of control, they argued, but of someone who knew exactly what he was doing. The careful documentation and sale of the videos proved that Matthew had been fully aware of his actions and their consequences. The defense's argument of mental illness as a primary factor fell apart under the weight of the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and profit. The turning point came when the jury was shown the financial records detailing Matthew's earnings from his dark web activities. It became clear that this was not a one-time mistake or momentary lapse in judgment. Matthew had profited from the pain and exploitation of others, making his crimes even more reprehensible. The case against Matthew Jennings was airtight, and as the trial dragged on, it became increasingly clear that the defense was fighting a losing battle. The jury deliberated for 2 days, weighing the charges of sexual assault, manslaughter in the death of his wife, and the distribution of illegal content. When they returned with their verdict, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Matthew was found guilty on all charges. The conviction included multiple counts of sexual assault, manslaughter for Hannah's death, and charges related to the creation and distribution of illegal material. As the verdict was read aloud, a heavy silence fell over the room. Matthew, who had remained stone-faced throughout most of the trial, slumped slightly in his chair, the reality of his fate sinking in. The judge, in his closing remarks, made it clear that Matthew's actions were a gross betrayal of trust, not only to his patients and family, but to the entire community. He condemned Matthew for exploiting his position as a caregiver and for the deep psychological damage inflicted on his victims. The sentence was harsh: life in prison without the possibility of parole for the sexual assault charges, and an additional 20 years for the manslaughter of his wife. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, the weight of the trial's conclusion hanging in the air. For the victims and their families, there was some sense of justice, though the emotional scars left behind would never fully heal. The town of Somerville would never forget the man who once wore a friendly smile, only to reveal himself as a predator hiding behind a mask of trust.